May 7, 1945. In the cold, damp shadows of a French technical college, General Dwight D. Eisenhower prepared to face his enemy, not with a handshake, but with a stony, implacable silence. This is the story of how the Third Reich collapsed in a humble schoolhouse, and why General Alfred Jodl believed he could negotiate with a ghost. Why did the war have to end twice? The end of the Third Reich did not begin in a grand palace, but in a 15-square-kilometer enclave near the Danish border. In the final days of April, following the suicide of Adolf Hitler in the Führer bunker, the political center of gravity for a dying empire shifted to the city of Flensburg. Here, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, appointed Reichspräsident by Hitler's final testament, presided over a phantom government headquartered at the Merwick Naval Academy. The war was lost, and the map of Europe was a jagged ruin of Allied advances. Yet Dönitz and his cabinet, including leading ministers Schwerin von Krosigk and Albert Speer, operated under a desperate tactical delusion. Dönitz's strategy was not immediate peace but calculated delay. This was the era of Operation Hannibal, the largest naval evacuation in human history. The German High Command knew that if they surrendered unconditionally to all powers, millions of their soldiers and refugees would fall into the hands of the Soviet Red Army. They feared Bolshevik rule far more than Western captivity. Dönitz ordered his emissaries to seek a separate peace with the United States and Great Britain, hoping to drive a wedge between the Western Allies and Joseph Stalin. It was a high-stakes gamble played with the lives of millions, and the man chosen to deliver the opening move was Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, the chief of the OKW operations staff. Jodl was the personification of the Prussian military tradition, appearing stiff, unyielding, and iron-willed. He believed he could walk into Allied headquarters and negotiate as a professional peer, a soldier speaking to other soldiers. On May 6, Jodl's plane landed at Reims, France. He was escorted to the Collège Moderne et Technique, a 3-story brick building known as the Little Red Schoolhouse. This was the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF. It was, as reporters at the time called it, the most secret of secret places in Europe. Inside the schoolhouse, the atmosphere was clinical and somber. General Eisenhower had made a moral vow. He would not meet with the Germans until they had signed an unconditional surrender. He refused to even offer them a chair or a glass of water until the document was finalized. Instead, he delegated the negotiations to his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith. Known as Eisenhower's hatchet man for his brusque and demanding manner, Smith was a bulldog of a negotiator. He met Jodl and Admiral von Friedeberg in a room on the second floor, a space known as the War Room. The War Room was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The walls were covered in hand-painted maps detailing the absolute collapse of the German lines. Maps showed the 101st Airborne and the 3rd Infantry Division racing toward the Bavarian Alps. Other charts listed staggering casualty numbers and the hopeless position of every remaining German unit. Smith ensured that Jodl sat directly across from these maps, forcing the Prussian general to stare at the physical evidence of his total defeat. The air in the room was thick with the scent of damp earth from spring showers and the heavy haze of Allied cigarettes. Jodl attempted to stall. He requested a 48-hour grace period before the surrender took effect, ostensibly to communicate the orders to his scattered troops, but in reality, he aimed to buy time for the Kriegsmarine to evacuate more refugees from the east. Bedell Smith, acting on Eisenhower's direct orders, was having none of it. He delivered a brutal ultimatum. If Jodl did not sign a general, unconditional surrender to all allies, including the Soviets, within 24 hours, Eisenhower would seal the Western Front. This was the leadership dilemma that would define the end of the war. If the Western Front was sealed, any German soldier or civilian attempting to flee from the Red Army would be pushed back at gunpoint. Jodl realized the gamble had failed. He radioed Dönitz in Flensburg, reporting that the Americans were unmoved by their pleas for a partial surrender. At 1:30 a.m. on May 7th, the radio crackled with Dönitz's reply, "Full power to sign in accordance with the conditions as given." The phantom government had finally collapsed under the weight of Allied resolve. The signing ceremony was scheduled for 2:30 a.m. The room was overcrowded with nearly 60 military personnel and press observers. Among them was Major General Ivan Susloparov, the Soviet liaison officer. His presence was a source of immense tension. While Susloparov was authorized to witness the proceedings, he had no explicit permission from Moscow to sign a final act of surrender. He had wired the text to the Kremlin hours earlier, but silence reigned in Moscow. Susloparov faced an existential choice: sign the document and risk Stalin's wrath, or refuse and allow the Germans to claim they had only surrendered to the West. At 2:41 a.m., the moment of finality arrived. Jodl sat at the simple wooden table, his face described by witnesses as a death mask, appearing drawn, gray with strain, and with every muscle clenched against the humiliation. Using a Parker 51 fountain pen, the man who had helped plan the invasions of Poland and the Soviet Union affixed his signature to the instrument of surrender. He was followed by Bedell, Smith, Susloparov, and the French General Savez. The war in Europe, at least on paper, was over. The language of the document was austere and absolute. Article 1 demanded the unconditional surrender of all forces on land, sea, and in the air. Article 3 specifically forbade the scuttling of any ships or aircraft, a direct response to the German Navy's actions at the end of the First World War. For the Allies, this was the crusade reaching its glorious conclusion. For Jodl, it was a delivery into the hands of the victors. He stood up, adjusted his iron cross, and asked for permission to speak. In a strangled voice, Jodl addressed the room in German. With this signature, the German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the victor's hands. In this hour, I can only express the hope that the victor will treat them with generosity one tide. His words were met with a stony, absolute silence. No Allied officer saluted. No one offered a hand. The Germans were escorted out of the room like criminals being led to their cells. But the most dramatic confrontation was yet to come. Following the signing, Smith escorted Jodl and Friedeberg to Eisenhower's private office. The Supreme Commander stood rigid behind his desk, his face a mask of cold disgust. Eisenhower's personal aide described the room as electric with his impatience. Eisenhower did not offer them chairs. He did not offer a drink. He looked at Jodl and asked a single, curt question. Do you understand the terms of the document of surrender you have just signed? When Jodl replied with a whispered, "Ja, ja," Eisenhower dismissed him with a silent, piercing stare. There was no soldierly respect and no gentlemanly conduct. By refusing to shake Jodl's hand, Eisenhower was making a moral statement that would echo through history. The Nazi high command were not peers. They were the architects of barbarism. As Jodl left the room, Eisenhower's dog, Telek, reportedly growled at the German general, a visceral symbol of the repulsion the Allies felt toward the regime. Outside the schoolhouse, the news began to leak despite a strict Allied embargo. The world was holding its breath. But in Moscow, Stalin was furious. He viewed the Reims ceremony as a preliminary protocol, a Western attempt to steal the glory of the Soviet victory. He demanded a second, grander signing in Berlin, the lair of the fascist beast. This historical enigma, the war that ended twice, was the first fracture in the alliance that had defeated Hitler. While the generals negotiated in France, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were finishing the job in the mountains. They had raced toward Berchtesgaden, Hitler's Alpine retreat, only to find that the 3rd Infantry Division had beaten them to the prize. They entered the Eagle's Nest, discovering wine lockers, stolen silver initialed ARH, and the ruins of the Berghof. The war was ending in a frenzy of relief, but the legal finality of the Reich was still being debated between the East and the West. As the ink dried on the Reims Protocol, the geopolitical reality of a divided Europe began to take shape. Stalin's refusal to recognize the May 7 signature was more than just a matter of prestige. It was a demand for total symbolic submission. He insisted that the final act of surrender must occur in the heart of the city the Red Army had conquered at such a staggering cost, Berlin. Eisenhower, recognizing the tangled skein of European politics, immediately agreed to a second ceremony to preserve the fragile unity of the coalition. The scene shifted to Karlshorst, Berlin, on the night of May 8th. Unlike the utilitarian schoolhouse in Reims, the Soviet headquarters was established in a former military engineering school, prepared with the grandiosity Stalin craved. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the conqueror of Berlin, presided over the table. This time, the German delegation was led by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the General Staff. Keitel arrived with his marshal's baton in hand, attempting to maintain an air of aristocratic military dignity that had long since been forfeited in the mud of the Eastern Front. The Berlin ceremony was delayed for hours by technical disputes and the preparation of the Russian language documents. While the Allied generals, including Air Chief Marshal Tedder and General Karl Spaatz, waited, the atmosphere was one of grim satisfaction. When the signing finally commenced, it was after midnight. This created the enduring historical discrepancy. While the West celebrates May 8th as VE Day, the Soviet Union and modern Russia celebrate May 9th. The war had ended twice, once for the law and once for the legend. The documents signed in Berlin were almost identical to the Reims instrument, but the symbolic weight was different. Keitel, his monocle swinging from its cord, signed the papers with red spots covering his face from the sheer stress of the humiliation. Zhukov watched him with a bright and sinister gaze, a look that did not leave the German's face for a second. This was the definitive fall of the Thousand-Year Reich, conducted in the very ruins of the aggression it had unleashed. But what of the men who signed these documents? For General Alfred Jodl, the signature at Reims was merely the first step toward the gallows. He would later stand trial at Nuremberg, charged with conspiracy to commit crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. The man who expected a handshake from Eisenhower would instead find himself at the end of a rope in 1946. The Allied refusal to treat him as a gentleman at Reims was the legal precursor to his execution as a war criminal. Admiral von Friedeberg, the man who had accompanied Jodl to Reims, chose a different path. Shortly after the final dissolution of the Flensburg government on May 23, 1945, Friedeberg committed suicide. He realized that the separate peace he had sought was an impossibility, and that the laws of war he had hoped would protect him would instead hold him accountable for the Kriegsmarine's actions. His death marked the final, silent end of the Dönitz administration. In Flensburg, the idyllic atmosphere of the phantom government was shattered on May 23rd. British troops, supported by elements of the 11th Armored Division, surrounded the Marineschule Mervik. They carried out Operation Blackout, arresting Dönitz, Jodl, and Speer. The soldiers of the Wehrmacht were disarmed, their Mauser K98K rifles and MP-40 submachine guns piled into massive heaps. The Thousand-Year Reich ended with German officers lined up against a wall, hands above their heads, under the watchful eyes of British bayonets. The scale of the disarmament was staggering. Millions of German troops surrendered their sidearms, Luger P-08s, Walther P-38s, and the first-generation ST-TG-44 assault rifles. These weapons, once the tools of a relentless blitzkrieg, were now mere scrap metal and souvenirs for Allied paratroopers. At the Harry S. Truman Library today, the very pens used by Eisenhower and Jodl at Reims are preserved. A Parker 51 and a gold fountain pen, as artifacts of the Battle of Wills that ended the slaughter. For the average German soldier, the surrender brought a sense of relief mixed with existential dread. Those who had surrendered to the West found themselves in massive POW camps, but they had avoided the Bolshevik rule they had been taught to fear. In the East, the fighting continued in pockets like Prague for days after the official ceasefire, as German units desperately tried to move west to reach the American lines. The 48-hour grace period Jodl had negotiated at Reims had saved countless thousands from Soviet captivity, a final secret victory for the Flensburg planners. Eisenhower's refusal to shake hands with Jodl was not just a personal snub, it was the moral statement that defined the post-war order. By treating the German high command as criminals rather than peers, Eisenhower washed the hands of the Allied armies. He ensured that the victory of the Great Crusade was not tainted by the comradeship of arms with a regime that had built concentration camps like Ohrdruf and Dachau. This was the ultimate justice that the Allied soldiers had fought for, from the beaches of Normandy to the heart of Germany. As the smoke cleared, the crusade had reached its glorious conclusion. Eisenhower's victory order of the day praised the Allied Expeditionary Force for a perfection in unification that had astonished the world. He acknowledged the hundreds of miles marked by the graves of comrades, men who had died as members of a team bound together by a common love of liberty. The Reims surrender was the administrative seal on a fate forged on the battlefields by the blood of many nations. The little Red Schoolhouse in Reims stands today as a museum, a shrine to history. The War Room remains exactly as it was on May 7, 1945. The maps are still on the walls, the simple wooden table still sits in the center of the room, and the air still seems to hold the palpable gravity of that historic night. It reminds us that the most monumental events in history often hinge on unglamorous, functional moments. A classroom converted into a command center, a technical college into a crossroads of destiny. The legacy of the Reims standoff is found in the transition from the hottest war in history to the long, cold tension of the following decades. Major General Susloparov, the man who signed without permission, was recalled to Moscow. While he avoided execution, his career was effectively over. A victim of the same hypersensitivity to historical record that drove Stalin to demand the Berlin ceremony. The V signs flashed by Eisenhower at Reims were the final celebratory sparks before the Iron Curtain began to descend. If we look back at the crucial decision point of the Reims negotiations, we see a leadership dilemma that could have ended in disaster. If Eisenhower had been more diplomatic, or if he had granted a longer delay, the alliance with the Soviets might have fractured even earlier. If Jodl had refused to sign, the war would have continued with a scorched earth intensity that would have cost millions more lives. Instead, the battle of wills at Reims produced a clinical, absolute finality that allowed the world to finally catch its breath. The man who refused to shake hands with a Nazi general became the 34th President of the United States. The man who signed the surrender died at the end of a rope. The ultimate insult at Reims was, in the end, the ultimate justice. History has judged that Eisenhower was right. Some enemies are so far beyond the pale of humanity that a handshake is a betrayal of the dead. The war was over. The crusade was finished. But the world that emerged from the little Red Schoolhouse was one forever changed by the events of May 7, 1945. We are the inheritors of that peace, a peace built on the austere language of an unconditional surrender and the steely resolve of a commander who knew that victory without moral clarity was no victory at all. If you were in Eisenhower's position at Reims, would you have treated the German generals as professional military peers? Or was his refusal to shake hands the only appropriate moral response to the crimes of the regime? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.